Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. An important but understudied phenomenon in late medieval northern art, despite its ubiquitous occurrence, is that of the animated image. Historians of the Reformation have frequently discussed one particular expression of this phenomenon, namely the belief, heavily criticized by reformers in the early 16th century, that objects and images, sculptures and painted, could embody the salvific power or even the living presence of Christ, the Virgin, or a saint. Such as, for example, here in reliquaries holding a thorn of the cross, the bones of a saint, or the milk of the Virgin Mary. Here you see two examples from the same workshop by the Dutch sculptor Niclas Gerhardt, who worked between France and Germany. And both busts contained a relic in the chest. And you can imagine that if the saint with this relic makes this speaking gesture and addresses you, you can very easily believe that they are really alive. However, it was scorned as idolatry if the believer confused the veneration of an image with the veneration of the holy person represented in the image, and the worship of God with the worship of his image. There are testimonies of iconoclastic outbreaks in the 16th century, during which rioters attacked images with an axe and mocked them for their incapacity to respond and to strike back. Historians have argued that these attacks testify to a residual belief of the iconoclast in the animated nature of the image. Medieval theologians, of course, had always warned against the erroneous belief that the effigy was identical with the persona it represents. Hagiographic accounts, on the other hand, saw no problem in recounting miraculous encounters with sculptures of Christ or the Virgin Mary, in which the image was seen bleeding, shedding tears, or blessing and even embracing a devotee. And I show you a few examples of St. Catherine of Siena, who in their devotion to Christ, saw in a vision Christ leaning forward to a crucifix, leaning forward to her. And in the right image you see how the crucifix actually loosens itself from the image. Or in this example of the so-called lactation of St. Bernard, where St. Bernard was praying in front of an image, and then he had the vision that the Virgin would spend her milk to him. So you see in both cases how the Virgin literally spends her milk through the image to St. Bernard. And here an example, beautiful example here in the Prado Museum itself by Alonso Cano. But beyond the theological discourse about idolatry and other forms of misuse of images, or stories about exceptional cases of sculptures and paintings miraculously coming alive, the question to which degree paintings and sculptures were created in order to feed this belief, that is, were created with the very purpose that people would see them indeed as animated by a higher spirit of power, that has really not been investigated. I'm not referring here to studies of literally moving images, such as the sculpture of the Salvator Mundi on your left, from a church in Germany, with this moving, which was made in order to behold to the vault of a church during Eastern and Ascension rituals. So it was taken up and then put down again. And I'm also not considering here sculptures such as the one on your right, which actually has literally moving arms. The sculpture can move. And which were therefore thought to enhance a sense of real presence among the devotee, real presence of the holy or divine virtue. What comes closer to what I have in mind to discuss today are grisaille paintings, on the exteriors of triptychs from the later 15th century, such as Hans Memling's triptych in Bruges, here on the screen, or an Annunciation painting in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Now, if you look carefully on the surface of this example, the figures of the angel and the Virgin Mary appear to be painted sculptures. But the hands and the face of these painted sculptures appear to be living tissue. It is as if the sculpture in these parts is coming alive, an impression the intensity of which is dependent on how you, the viewer, get involved in carefully scrutinizing the image in order to determine whether one is imaging or imagining life and more life than there actually is. So you will screen with your eye and say, is it just the face that is alive, or also the hands, and where does stone transform into real living tissue? To a certain degree that you might at some point think that the entire sculpture can come alive before your eyes. The sculpture, this image in other words, highly relies on a participatory act of viewing on part of the beholder, which engages both your physical eyesight but also your imagination. This process becomes particularly meaningful if you realize that the process of seeing these painted sculptures coming alive before your outer and inner eye echoes the very mystery of the incarnation that is represented in these figures. It is the mystery of God's Son assuming human flesh. You see, literally, so to speak, the incarnation coming true before your own eyes. The suggestion of the image coming to life, which is produced by perceiving subtle changes and fissures in the uniformity of pictorial illusion, can be found in much larger set of late medieval artworks than people usually realize. One encounters this phenomenon especially in representations of the Mass of St. Gregory, the topic that is represented also on the exterior of the Prado Epiphany triptych. The emergence of this iconographical type of the Mass of St. Gregory has a complicated story. I will not recount it in detail, but it circles around the legend that Pope Gregory the Great once had a vision of Christ appearing in the flesh on the altar when the Pope was reading Mass, in order to underscore the theological dogma of the true presence of Christ's sacrificial body in the Eucharist, in the consecrated host. This iconography gained wide traction in Northern art, especially in the 15th and early 16th centuries. It has been argued that this occurred in connection with the wish of lay people who felt uneasy or not fit to participate in the actual consumption of the consecrated host, to consume the Eucharist spiritually, that is, through the eyes of the heart, through their visual participation, and still then receive the grace emanating from Christ's true presence in the host. So you consume visually, but not with your mouth. In order to satisfy this desire of many lay people, we have many accounts testifying that, priests engage in the ritual develop the habit of elevating the host immediately after the consecration ritual, so that everyone in the church would be able to see Christ's sacrificial body, as is represented here in this image German painting, where the priest is holding the host high up. And you see the resonance in the painting between the figure of Christ, the man of sorrows standing in the sarcophagus, and the host. Since altarpieces showing the Mass of St. Gregory were widespread in countries north of the Alps, many attendants of the Mass would see the host being elevated against the backdrop, as you see here, against the backdrop of an image of Christ appearing in bodily shape on the altar of St. Gregory. That resonance would then help see the believer to see with their physical eyes what the church taught them to see with their spiritual eyes in the elevated host. This is all relevant, as you will see, for Bosch. But many images of the Mass of St. Gregory in this way emphasize both the visionary and the bodily character of Christ's appearance on the altar of the Pope. In order to achieve this effect, 15th and early 16th century artists manipulated the traditional image of the Man of Sorrows, standing in a sarcophagus and displaying the signs of the Passion on his body, which is at the root of this imagery. Here you see an early example, the Man of Sorrows standing in a sarcophagus. And here a transformation of the Man of Sorrows now being integrated in the Mass of St. Gregory, appearing to St. Gregory who is holding up the host. So artists dynamized, as you see here in a way, the static nature of the original iconographic type, on your left, by showing the Man of Sorrows physically sometimes stepping onto Gregory's altar, as you see here in the painting, again in the Prado Museum, by the Flemish artist Isenbrand. Christ literally steps onto the altar. Another Flemish artist, Simon Bening, gave the Man of Sorrows type a partly visionary setting inside a canopy behind the altar, which is opened for the viewer by two angels. The sarcophagus does not partake in this visionary realm. It is a solid object standing on the back of Gregory's altar, as you see here. This is the vision, but this is so it seems a real physical sarcophagus. This shift towards the haptic presence creates a tension regarding the nature of the vision, especially the figure of Christ, whose lively flesh colors contrast with the more abstract monochrome coloring of the Passion instruments behind him. This contrast pushes his figure visually forward to the viewer, creating the suggestion that Christ's body loosens himself from the visionary realm and physically enters the space of Gregory's altar. This causes the image to be understood as a visual translation of the mystery of the transformation of the host into the Eucharist, and the idea of the Presencia realis, the true presence of Christ's sacrificial body on the altar in the consecrated host. A painting by the anonymous Bartholomew Master in Trier makes the dynamics of the transition from visionary figure to concrete body visually even more striking, as Christ's figure leans over the edge of the sarcophagus, leaving the visionary realm behind, and assumes bodily presence on the altar. You see his left hand already taking bodily shape. In other cases, the visionary realm is merged with a painted or sculpted altarpiece that is placed at the back of Gregory's altar. This is a fascinating example of the so-called master of the Aachener altar, where you see a conflation of the vision in which Christ appears to Gregory, but Christ has already left the sarcophagus and standing now on the rim of this construction, the physical rim that is part of the background of the altar. So Christ is literally about to appear in the flesh. This creates this impression that Christ looses himself, is about to step down from the altarpiece, so that the altarpiece in a way produces Christ. As you see here, an exceptional example of a huge figure of Christ who has loosened himself from this altarpiece in the background and literally stands on the frame and is about to step onto Gregory's altar. So you see this stepping onto the altar here is a detail of Christ from the vision is very similar to the image of St. Catherine, who sees the crucifix leaning forward to her. All these images suggest that the retablo, the altarpiece, has a revelatory function. That is the power to stimulate the imagination of the viewer and to breathe life into your eyes, so that you see Christ bodily appearing on the altar. It needs to be emphasized that our perception and interpretation of these images should always take into account that originally they were connected with the Mass, and these images actually stood on an altar, so that the real presence of Christ is in the host that the priest has in his hands and then that you see it sitting in the church, that occurring against the backdrop of the altarpiece. So the altarpiece has a supporting function. This all, I think, has a bearing on Jheronimus Bosch. In conformity with the custom of the period, Bosch's period, to paint the exterior of a triptych in chromatically subdued palette, Bosch has represented Gregory's vision in yellowish-brown tones, like a grisaille. We are offered a frontal view of the saint's altar, where Christ is shown as man of sorrows, appearing in the flesh, against the backdrop of an elaborate, multi-layered altarpiece that stands at the rear of the altar. This altarpiece is complex in both its material and representational structure. The lower part consists of a seemingly three-dimensional sarcophagus, a real thing, that stands on Gregory's altar, in which Christ appears to be standing as a three-dimensional figure. The shadow of his body, which you see here, the shadow of his body is casting on what looks like a flat stone tablet or tombstone behind him, which suggests that he's standing in front of this tablet. The tonal palette of both that backdrop, but also his own figure of Christ, which is represented in a graphic, slightly sketchy style, counteracts, seems to deny this interpretation, and suggests that the figure and his background are both part of a painted altarpiece. This strange ambivalence as to whether we are dealing with a three-dimensional structure or with a flat painted surface extends towards the edges of the construct. I'm not talking about this frame. There is an inner frieze, or actually two frames. I'm first talking about this part, and then about this part. There is an inner frieze of angels surrounding the man of sorrows that seems to be painted, perhaps, but also perhaps executed in stone, in relief. And then you have this outer frieze of scenes representing the Stations of the Cross, which appear to be painted in grisaille. A strange shift in material. The fact that this outer frieze is not framed, as is normally the case in painted altarpieces, or perhaps is the very painted frame of the entire construction, which echoes actually the general form of the overall altarpiece, which also creates another level of ambivalence or unclarity. And all of this, and this is the most extraordinary, fascinating, extraordinary thing that Bosch has ever painted beyond all his demons. That is the following, here in the Prado Museum, this scene. This scene of the crucifixion is on the one hand part of the painted frieze of passion scenes, but at the same time it is real, it is three-dimensional. It is really there, sitting on top of the altarpiece. A real hill that is situated on top of the altarpiece. And you see that the sky above this hill is a real sky, which is filled with dark clouds, which without any clear breaks, strangely enough, shade off into the church interior further down below, where Gregory's altar is situated. The fact that everything is executed in an almost monochrome palette blurs these distinctions, blurs the temporal and spatial distinctions of the real world that we seem to be sitting in front of the altar, and this imaginary world, which serves this strange shift, serves the so-called typological connection between the crucifixion on top and the renewed crucifixion of Christ actually in the host. When the priest breaks the host, it is as if Christ is renewed, crucified. So the overall suggestion is that the historical reality of the Passion, the real thing, the pictorial world of the altarpiece, lower, and the material world of Gregory's altar over here, and then of course also over here, all of this is intertwined and transformed by the manifestation of Christ's salvific presence and incarnational grace. Now this is as such maybe not new. That is, Bosch's painting visualizes solid traditional Catholic dogma. But the way he does that, the way he visualizes these connections and gives the viewer an active participatory role in perceiving these connections and shifts in reality is unequaled. For the force of divine grace is invisible, of course, other than in the person of the Son and in his renewed sacrifice in the Eucharist. But the representational and material ambivalences of the altarpiece connecting the Passion on top and Gregory's altar in front enhance the sense of an all-encompassing divine grace and connectedness and intertwinement. And then finally produce the effect of the Man of Sorrows in your imagination moving forward from the altarpiece towards you. The careful perception by the viewer of the material and representational ambivalences and astonishing feats that Bosch presents, and also the inconsistencies, apparent inconsistencies in material representation of the altarpiece, play a major role in producing this sensation. It is the ambivalences that you perceive, that is what makes you see this coming alive. The perception of these ambivalences and inconsistencies produce a certain oscillating animation effect, if you will, in the transition zones between the real historical world at the top of the retablo, the painted grisaille frieze with the Stations of the Cross, the stone tablet with the frieze of the chiseled angels, and then the painted figure of Christ, whose body at the same time casts its shadow against the backdrop, while his body at the same time takes shape in the three-dimensional space of Gregory. The painting, in other words, produces the same kind of, if you will, animation effect as Memling's and David's Annunciation's grisailles, where you too perform the act of seeing the incarnation coming alive. But the cascading animation effect does not halt, of course, at Gregory's altar, that is clear. It continues into our own physical world. Since, which you can see with your own eyes if you go to the Prado Museum here, down, further, 100 meters from here, we can see the real painting, of course. And there you can see that the figure of the Man of Sorrows is painted on top of the closed, so this is the triptych that is closed, and you see the two outer frames touching each other in closed form, and it is on the frame that Christ is painted, and actually also the crucifixion is painted. So the suggestion then is that if you open the triptych, it is as if you break the host, that you crucify. Just by opening the triptych, you crucify the body of Christ. With this analysis, I think we have a proper point of departure for a look also at the interior of the painting. Now, the exterior of the late medieval altarpieces, especially when they were executed in grisaille, had an anticipatory function for viewing the brightly painted interior. So you had the contrast between grisaille on the exterior and full color in the interior, which of course evoked associations with the idea of foreshadowing and fulfillment. So the interior, with its representation of the Adoration of the Magi, has been the object of several studies concentrating on the iconography of individual motifs, especially those that stand out against more traditional representations of this theme. I'm not going to go into all these details. The painting appears to have been a commission. We know the patrons, and the patron saints you see depicted behind them on the wings. But I'm going to concentrate on the central scene, the central panel. These patrons are shown kneeling in devout adoration of the newborn Christ child, following the three Magi who have gathered in the foreground of the central panel to present their gifts to the Virgin and her child. The Virgin is placed against the backdrop of a dilapidated stable where she has given birth to the child according to the Gospels. The setting is unusual in that Bosch has placed the stable in a vast landscape that connects all three panels from forward to background, and thus offers an opportunity to depict many details. In the background you see Jerusalem, but further down, further towards the foreground, you're not sure if it is Palestine or it is actually the Flemish countryside. We have already discussed some of this conflation as a depiction of the non-Christian world of Jews and the heathens, of the people the Jews, that is, who have not accepted Christ as their Messiah. I'm going to show you again a few examples of a few details that illustrate this. The world in which Christ is born is a hostile world, which shows hordes of soldiers roaming the countryside, but also some ominous signs of evil even in the direct vicinity of the child. These are not imminent immediately, eminently evident, as the foreground is of course dominated by the figures of the Magi, who present their gifts to the newly born child as token of reverence and acknowledgement of its divine nature. They see in this little kid the divine presence. The dresses of these Magi's and gifts that is strange, are decorated with small scenes illustrating stories of the Old Testament that were traditionally seen as prefigurations of this epiphany and Jesus' role as Messiah. Thus the oldest Magus or king, go back, sorry. The oldest Magus or king who kneels in front of the child has brought a sculpture with him. You see it here in the foreground. And here you see a detail on the left, which represents, that's clearly visible, the sacrifice of Abraham, which was traditionally thought to be a prefiguration of Jesus' passion and crucifixion and the carrying of the cross. As you see here in a much earlier representation, the connection between Christ carrying the cross and the sacrifice of Abraham. The scene on the collar of the second king illustrates the visit of Queen Sheba to Solomon, again shown in a similar fashion in a much earlier representation of this so-called typological connection, prefiguration, connected here to another representation that was connected, seen as a prefiguration that is connected to the third king here. This scene clearly resembles that scene. It is another representation of King David. That is the three warriors offering water to King David, which you find in the Old Testament. So the figure of the Christ child in this painting, which we blow up enormously here, but in reality, of course, is very, very small. This figure is very tiny as it sits naked on his mother's lap. His mother's lap, or his mother, who is by comparison an enormous and monumental figure. These formal aspects, these characteristics, also belong to the means with which the iconography of the Adoration of the Magi traditionally visualizes the portentous nature of the event. That is, the witnessing of the heavenly and the divine origin of the child and the messianic nature of his kingdom. Mary's lap is the throne of God, but also symbolizes the Christian altar of the church, where the sacrifice of the Messiah will be reenacted. What makes Bosch's treatment of the topic unusual are the tokens of evil and hostility that he has added to this traditional imagery, quite near the Christ child, and the way he has integrated the world of signs into the real world, like he did on the exterior. whereby he actualizes the connection between the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the here and now. The object showing the sacrifice of Abraham offers a first uncanny example of this presence, not only of the divine, but also of an evil force. The golden plate on which this sculpture, here the detail, is mounted, rests on the backs of 3 black toads. They are arranged formally in such a way at regular intervals that first your impression may be, if you see them at all, that they are part of the decorative support of the sculpture. Their black color, however, contrasts with the yellowish shine of the golden base. This and their white beady eyes that stand out against the black create the impression that they are real living creatures that are staring at us. This is not only quite confusing for us, as if the sculpture is coming to life at the base, but it's also unsettling, since toads have infernal associations in Bosch's oeuvre. For example, in the famous Last Judgment in Vienna. So do we perceive here the stealth signs of the force that subverts the order of God's creation ever since the fall, and animates and infects even inorganic matter? The strange discrepancy between the lifelikeness of these amphibians and the inorganic material of the golden plate, moreover, creates a potentially extended animation effect that we have observed in the play with different levels of representational and real matter on the exterior of the triptych. So this phenomenon is in a way similar to what we saw on the exterior. If the toad supporters of the golden sculpture are alive, or seem to come alive even for a second, a suggestion. Huh? Are they? No, they are not alive. Are they alive? Where do we draw the line? Do the gold and the pearls decorating the base solidly belong to a different world of inorganic matter? If the frogs are alive, the toads are alive? But isn't the very purpose of the sculpture to offer evidence of the relevance of the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament for the living presence of the newborn child? Isn't it the purpose of this and other typological imagery, these other subsidiary scenes, like it is on the exterior of the triptych, to come alive in the here and now? Other details in the gowns and gifts of the Magi only increase the confusion. The border of the gown of the Black King, here, and you have to look very, very carefully in reality to perceive what I'm describing to you. So the border of the gown of the Black King is decorated with a frieze of birds and hybrid bird-like creatures with human heads, strange forms. They are shown picking small berries, as you see, or kernels of some sort originating from a fruit capsule that is attached to a thorny branch. Here. The precise meaning of these motifs is unclear, but similarities between these hybrid birds and representations of the so-called harpies are clear. Harpies were a legendary species that were described in this encyclopedia that I told you about in the first lecture, and that show you the wonders of the world. So are these real birds? Possibly, but they have negative connotations. One of the writers of these encyclopedias, the Dutch writer Marland, says of the creature of these harpies on the right that it has large claws and a human face, and although it resembles man, he says there is no humanity to it. There is no humanity to it. It looks human, but it doesn't. It appears human, but it isn't human. And of course, human, not human, it appears human. You hear that resonating with this whole theology of the incarnation, the God becoming flesh. It's almost like a comment. The creature, these harpies, live far away in the desert, and Marland describes how it is always starving. but it sometimes kills a person. And when it does, it realizes if it had done so and becomes very sad. And all these motifs, the eating, the killing, becoming sad, you can hear, if you know a little bit about late medieval religion, you can hear resonances with the topic, of course, of the Eucharist, the eating of the body of Christ in the Eucharist. You hear the topic of sadness, of compassion. If you go to the galleries here and you look at Roger van der Weyden's beautiful painting of the Madonna swooning when Christ descends from the cross, a painting that appeals to your compassion. Those themes are very, very central to late medieval religion and seem to be commented on in a kind of negative way by these borders. According to the art historian Michael Camille, marginal illustrations in late medieval prayer books, where you find these harpies, often function as glosses, as comments, as revealing comments on the main theme or representation of the image to which they were attached. This seems to be a very relevant point to bring to your attention, since Bosch seems to have derived motifs in several of his paintings from such marginal illustrations, from these border illustrations. Now, the central function of Bosch's triptych, we recall, is to serve as a backdrop for the Mass, in particular to highlight the mystery of the transformation of the piece of bread, the host, into the real sacrificial body of Christ. This is the function of the triptych in both its closed and its open state. Both the exterior and the interior, moreover, visualize this mystery in incarnational terms, in incarnational motifs, or in motifs that comment on the incarnation. The exterior explains Christ's appearance on Gregory's altar as a reincarnation of Christ's sacrifice on the cross and Golgotha. The interior relates Christ, the incarnated Son of God, to his future renewed sacrifice on the Christian altar, which is symbolized by the Virgin's body. And it seems that this incarnational theme is therefore commented on in the frieze of the Black Magus, the king from afar. Like the Magi, the winged harpies on the frieze represent the heathens, the pagans who insatiably hunger for the bread of the angels. And the bread of the angels is actually represented on this frieze surrounding Christ. These angels were supposed to bring to mind that the host was called the bread of the angels. There too you see, if you will, a border pun, a comment on the nature of Christ as food for the believers. Now, a strange detail, and I'm coming back to this detail in the interior. A strange detail just below the frieze, here. And this shows you how carefully you have to look at Bosch. A strange detail below the frieze seems to have a particular bearing on all of this. Most of the small berries on the frieze are concentrated on the right side of the Magus hem. Here, right? There are most of these berry-like things. Just above a vertical string of pearls, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that decorate the lower part of a fold in the king's robe. Now this again is confusing, since for the viewer, for us, there is no real difference whatsoever in the appearance of these pearls and the berries on the same frieze. It seems as if the berries, which are part of the flat decorative border that is woven into the fabric of the Magus gown further down, are transformed into real three-dimensional pearls. Can you make a distinction between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and the other pearls or berries? We cannot. It is willfully confusing. It is here, as is the case on the exterior of the triptych, that we see this strange animation effect that is caused by a disturbance in what we seem to be seeing in the material nature of the sign. It is this animation effect, if you will, is a pun on the incarnation. It is an incarnational effect, so to speak, a comment on the mystery phenomenon of the incarnation. If we follow with our eyes the string of pearls upwards, as I did show to you, you will see that the only berry on the frieze that is actually picked by the bird, the only one, can be read as the next 6th pearl in the row upwards. And it is precisely there that the distinction between the sign and the thing it represents dissolves into a melee of berries, and the world of signs assumes the appearance of real things. The characteristic of harpies, mentioned by the writer from Marland, that they have the face of humans but lack humanity, can now be understood, moreover, as an inversive pun, typical for marginal border illustrations on the paradox, on the paradoxical mystery of the true humanity of the Son of God, or of the true divine nature of this small kid. Now you may think that I'm really overinterpreting here, even if you follow my careful analysis of these details. Now I'd like to point out to you a very, very striking new piece of finding, a recent finding, offered by the reservation department of the Prado Museum doing the research that they did of this triptych in preparation for the Bosch exhibition. During their preparation, they discovered in the underdrawing, that is in the preliminary drawing, painting or drawing, underlying the final paint layer of this figure, who, according to many art historians, either represents the Jewish high priest or the Antichrist, or actually is a combination probably of these two figures, who is standing in the door opening and is watching the adoration of the Magi. That they found in the underdrawing of, underneath the headgear of this figure, they found this. A figure holding up a round circular form. As far as I'm aware, that has not been commented on in the catalog, but it is a really interesting finding, I think. Why? Because we know this motif. There you have it. In the triptych of the Temptation of St. Anthony, which was also in Lisbon, which was also here in the exhibition. In St. Anthony's, in the triptych of St. Anthony's Temptations, this motif is a parody on the Christian Mass, a parody on the real presence of Christ in the consecrated host, which in that painting is represented in the background, is counterfeited by this image of Christ, the real figure of Christ standing next to the altar, where you see a very lively image of himself on the crucifix. And in the real painting, you see this figure, very, very small in the background, and this scenery much bigger in the foreground. So this is a parody on the nature of the true Eucharist, Christ being the true image of God also in this world. And here you see, bring up again, that all of this holding up what appears to be an egg or so, in this case, is a negative comment on this habit to elevate the host in the hands of the priest. Now, in Bosch's time, the Jews were said to be blind to the central tenet of the Christian belief, namely that Christ is the Messiah and that he is sacrificed again on the altar. And it seems to be precisely the role of these onlookers in the background to exemplify the blindness of the Jews to Jesus as the true Messiah, and their blindness and the blindness of all non-believers, of which the Jews were seen as exemplary, blindness to the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist, in the consecrated host. So the pictorial sign, the pictorial motif, that acts as a kind of veil, but at the same time is a kind of an animation machine for the viewer, bridging different realities, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the altar of St. Gregory, the altar on which the altarpiece is standing in the here and now. I'm talking about the late 15th century. All of this merges, of course, together. And I'm going to show you one more example. I'm talking about this headgear, which actually belongs to the second king. And here you have a detail. So this, the image on the gown, on the collar of the king, shows the visit of Queen Sheba to King Solomon, which prefigures the adoration of the Magi. The palace architecture, and you have to really look very carefully to the way Bosch has represented things. Not only when you look at details such as the border of one magus and these pearls, but you have to look at every single detail with this kind of wondering eye. And what you see then is, again, something that is confusing, that is ambivalent, that seems to be a paradox. I'm talking about the architecture, the palace architecture, that is the environment of this scene. The palace architecture forming the setting for the queen's visit follows the curvature of the collar, suggesting that the image consists of fine embroidery woven into the collar. So now I'm talking about the material thing of which this is made of. But one detail makes this reading, again, ambivalent. The scene of the audience of the queen is located beneath an arcade. You can see that here. Is located underneath an arcade, which is supported in the center by a column decorated with a dotted pattern here, this one. This pattern, as well as the arcade, transform without a marked transition into the concrete fabric of the collar around the Magi's neck. So the realities of the historical prefiguration of the adoration of the Magi and the actual adoration again merge. The paradox serves to merge all this. And our effort is, and our impulse is to disentangle, and the more we disentangle, it's more like elastic. Then it bounces back and we see how all of this is interconnected. But here too, in the turban of the Magus, this thing, we see something, again, ambiguous, paradoxical. The turban shows a series of layered friezes, and I turned the image upside down, otherwise we would have difficulties really seeing it. So I'm talking about these layers in the turban. The layers of friezes with precious stones and animal figures that are engaged in an action, the precise nature of which, quite remarkable, can only be made out if, again, you turn your head 180 degrees upside down. That is to say, when we invert our regular position of vision and assume a different perspective, a closer perspective, something that we do not expect ourselves to be able to perform with. It turns out, when you turn your vision, it turns out that the lowest frieze, here now upside down, the lowest frieze, consists of a series of large ibis-like white birds that seem to be painted on a brown-grayish ground. The next layer, the next strip, shows a row of rubies and 4 hooded ape-like creatures executed in 3-dimensional relief. You can see that because they're just sticking out here on the side, on the border, judging by the outer left and right heads that protrude from the contours of the headgear. And then it is very striking to discover that all these 4 ape-like figures have broken the ranks of being purely decorative shapes. 3 of the creatures are reaching down to the birds in an effort to attack them. And one of these birds, as you see, is already being strangled. A fourth ape has turned around and is busy removing or stealing, it seems, on the left, one of the red gems. It is not only the aggressive nature of these actions and the fact that they defy any logic within the conventional narrative of the adoration, or defy any logic of representational art in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, part 2. This is where Bosch is absolutely unique, daring, revolutionary. And it is alarming what he shows. Even more unsettling is that the ape-like creatures are depicted as being in the process of freeing themselves from the painting, freeing themselves from their role as decorative shapes, and becoming real actors. So, coming to a conclusion. Jheronimus Bosch's so-called Epiphany triptych, here the exterior showing the Mass of St. Gregory, and here unfolding the Adoration of the Magi, is an altarpiece in the true sense of the word. As no other painting of the period does it serve the Catholic doctrine. Bosch is very traditional theologically. He serves the Catholic doctrine and the belief of many people that the altar is the place where the mystery of Christ's renewed sacrifice for mankind becomes reality. Reality through the true presence of his sacral body in the host. Bosch's painting goes beyond other altarpieces of the period in showing that the presence of evil in this world is equally real. This presence is given form in rather subtle ways. We have seen that. Visible only to the perceptive viewer. When we viewers play our role and do the work of carefully probing the surface of the painting, we discover that this surface is alive, animated by these very metaphysical forces. Thank you.